All right. So I am Andy Carone, and I'm going to be working with you today on Marketo Certified Expert preparation for the fundamentals component of the exam. So I am a Marketo champion. I'm Fearless 50. I'm one of the user group leaders here in Chicago, and I'm also a Marketo certified expert. I took my first exam in 2013, which I passed, and I've taken and passed every derivation of different certification that they've had out there since then, as well as the now defunct, no longer available certifications that they used to have. Shameless plug, I will be at Adobe Summit. So if you think you might attend, schedulers open now as you register, or if you've already registered, go in and start registering for your sessions. I'll be presenting 3 different sessions, one on ROI, one on massive failures and how to flip that around and turn that into something of value, and then person source or lead source. All right, so we're going to go over just some basic general certification information, and then we're going to look at program types, channels and statuses, programs in general, sort of that program sync if you have Salesforce, assets, smart campaigns, and then acquisition as it relates to programs. Generally, the way that I like to run these things is we'll have a time for Q&A at the end, and if you want to ask questions at the end, you're more than welcome to. But I would love to keep this a little bit more interactive. So as we're running through the slides, if you have a question on a particular slide or you want a little bit more information about a component of it, just go ahead and holler it out. Pause me and I will address that, because I find often when I save my questions until the end, they don't make as much sense as they did at the time that I was like, oh, I want to know about X or Y or Z. By all means, if you're not a verbal person and you want to type it in the comments, etc., I'll address those at the end as well. All right, so let's get rolling. All right, so the Marketo certification for the expert version, we're not looking at the associate level, we're looking at the expert, right? It's 75 questions. You have 90 minutes to take it, although it doesn't usually take people the full time. And the minimum passing score is 70%. And this means that you have to pass all of the focus areas. So today we're focusing just on the fundamentals, and that comprises the largest percentage of the questions on the test. So 30% of the exam is devoted to the information that we're going to cover today. So we're going to dive right in. Everything I cover here today is more about telling you what to look for as gaps in your knowledge, as opposed to giving you that knowledge for the first time. So if you stumble across something as we're going here where you're like, I don't know about this, that's an opportunity to use Marketo documentation or to circle up with one of the champions during the upcoming office hours that we're hosting to dig in on that and get a little bit more familiar with that particular area that you might not have as deep an amount of knowledge in that would assist you with the test. So for the MCE, they're going to expect you to know the 4 different Marketo program types. The general email or email send, which looks like a little mailbox in there, events, which have the calendar, engagement, which is the little potted plant, and then default, which looks like the old-fashioned filofax that I think I had in high school for keeping my friends' names and addresses and such in. Within each of those program types, there are sub-channels. So some standard ones that you'll often see for event include conference, things like maybe dinners, trade shows, webinars. These are pretty consistent in here. And then within default, often new systems will come with email blast, which is a little different than email send. And then content syndication, list purchases, etc. So it's good to understand the types of programs or channels that live within the program types in a standard system. They're not looking necessarily for like, how hyper customized have you made your system? Have you created different channels for different types of engagement where you have different statuses or that type of thing? They're just looking for the out of the box setup Do you understand that there are 4 types of programs and the types of channels that live on each one of them? And then they're looking for beyond channels statuses. So do you understand what a program status is? And do you understand where to modify them and how they work? So essentially, if you you have a webinar, for example, do you understand why it's important to move someone from registered to attended and how that works with a webinar program, right? Do you understand that you want to be adding people to the program level with a status and progressing them through? So this is a core fundamental part of Marketo, but it surprises, well, it shouldn't surprise me because I was one of those people way back in the day. I didn't understand the value of statuses, and it just seemed like an extra needless step, but it is really an important part. So they're going to test you on that. All right, so quick sample question. A marketing manager needs to gate a piece of content on the company website. Which 3 channels and program types correspond to this activity? So basically they're saying there are 3 here that you could pick from. You wouldn't build 3 programs, but depending on your system setup, which of these 3 would be the correct choice, any of these 3, for this type of activity of putting a piece of content on your website. So does anyone want to throw their hand up? They think they know the answer. All right, get your answers down in your head. And you should have D, E, and F. So these would all be within the default program type. And then channels of content, web form, or web content could potentially all be correct here. Although I personally tend to use web form for things like contact us, and not for any sort of form. If you're not sure why these are the answers, there are very good resources on docs.marketo.com that can tell you exactly kind of what and the why and how of this. So digging in on default programs, basically here they just want to make sure that you understand what default programs can be used for so that operational lives here. If you have your web forms, your web content, anything along those lines, list imports, right? You'll notice we have an email nurture here. So sometimes you might have a nested send program inside of a nurture that you would use this for. There are a variety of different purposes, but they want to know that you understand what makes the default kind of the core based choice for most program types. Okay. And then the email send program. So with this, they're going to want to know several things, but most importantly, they're going to want to make sure that you understand the 4 different control panel components, what each one does, and then also the dashboard and what is reported here and how it's reported. So what does this engagement score mean? How are these things calculated? And how does that vary depending on, let's say, if you're using the send in the individual's time zone, for example, right? So that recipient time zone send. They're also going to test you on A/B testing. So if you're not familiar with A/B testing within the send program, familiarize yourself. The way that you schedule an email for A/B testing is different than the way that you A/B test on other emails or schedule an email send without an A/B test. Okay, so for events, particular things you're going to want to make sure you are familiar with, webinar event partners. So when you create a webinar, if you're syncing that to your event partner, which you probably will want to do, what that process looks like. So that event partner where it says not set, what that looks like, and also obviously the launch point component, right, is going to be part and parcel with that. They're also going to want you to be familiar with Marketo's check-in app. So if you've never played with the app or you're not familiar with it, and you have access to, let's say, an iPad, go ahead and download it and just play around with it so that you understand what the check-in app's function is, how it works, what it looks like. With the engagement program, this one, if you're not as familiar, is definitely a larger sort of nut to crack, right? There's a lot more to dig in on here that is different from the way that other programs function. Really what they want to make sure that you understand here is the terminology. So they want to make sure that you understand what a stream is, what the cadence equates to, that's actually your schedule. They want to make sure that you understand how content is added and activated and how content reacts across the different streams. So if you're not familiar with the fact that you can put an email in stream 1 and stream 2 and have confidence that it'll only be delivered to a program member once, that's probably a good litmus test that it might be a good idea to spend some extra time studying specifically around nurture and engagement programs. As a little bit of a crib sheet, I've put together these sort of glossary terms. So if you aren't familiar with stream, cast, cadence, transition rules, program statuses, that pause, normal sort of component of the programs, or exhausted content, and you don't also potentially know the difference between pausing someone in the program and removing them from the program, these would be areas to spend some time studying specifically around engagement to make sure that you are good to go for taking the MCE. So we have a sample question straight from Marketo. A content marketing manager has 1,000 leads in an engagement program, 110 of which have exhausted all the content. The content marketing manager recently completed a new white paper and has added the new content into the program at the top of the only stream in the program. And then they want to know how many leads will receive the new white paper at the next cast, assuming that there are no deliverability issues and no additional people will be added to the program. So essentially what they want to make sure that you understand here is if you have a single stream and you add new content at the very beginning of it, how is the audience going to react or be treated by the engagement program as they flow through on the next scheduled cast? So the answer here is C, right? Because when you put a new piece of content at the top of a stream, everyone gets the topmost piece of content that they haven't received yet, right? So everybody would receive it, regardless of whether they're exhausted or wherever they are, right? Because that's going to be the first possible thing. And once you've added new content, they're not exhausted anymore. They have one eligible piece of content. After they receive it, they'll go back to being exhausted. This is also a really good example of the types of questions that you'll tend to see on the MCE. I feel like often they give almost too much information, not intentionally to be confusing or anything, but just kind of that's the style in which it's written. So sometimes you really have to read between the lines and say, okay, so they've got 100 leads in an engagement program and they've added a new piece of content at the top of the stream and there's only one stream. Okay, everybody's getting it, right? That is basically what they're saying here. They've just thrown in this exhausted to kind of make you think for a second. The only thing that would change this 1,000 is if you had people who were paused, right? All right, so if you have Salesforce, you're probably familiar with this. If you're working with a different CRM, then you may not be, but they will expect you to understand how the Salesforce program or campaign sync works. So essentially the fact that you can create a campaign on the Salesforce side and sync them, or you can create a campaign from the actual Marketo side and push that over with all of the statuses that exist inside of Marketo. So if you're not as familiar with this, again, something to study up on. Okay, so assets are probably one of the larger areas that they'll sample maybe a few less questions from, but they'll really want to make sure that you understand how assets work. So they're going to want to make sure that you understand how to create assets, what your asset types are, so that at the local program level, those include your emails, your landing pages, your forms, right? And then additionally, smart lists and lists. And your smart campaigns can technically be considered a local asset also. They are in the local asset create new when you pull that up. There are also some additional kind of like secondary types that people don't use very much. So some of those social buttons, the YouTube, the polls, things like that, which you have to have activated in order to use them. They also want to make sure that you understand the rules around the assets. So, for example, do you know the difference in an email between an email that is standard and one that is operational? So do you understand how having an email go out that will react to people being checkmarked true for unsubscribe versus those that bypass all of those rules, right? How that works. And then they also want to know, do you understand local, meaning it lives inside of a program and marketing activities, versus global? So for example, your unsubscribe page, which lives in Design Studio, might be considered a global, or would be considered a global asset. You might have forms, let's say a webinar form that you use on different Marketo landing pages across every single one of your pages. And so rather than replicating that form over and over and over again in each program, you just keep it here inside of your global forms. So it's really important to understand that differentiation of where it lives and what its function is based on that local versus global. Within smart campaigns, they're going to want to make sure that you understand the logic of how smart campaigns work. So within filters, they're going to want to make sure that you can differentiate between the all, which would be and, the any, which would be or, and the advanced logic, which would be an and, or however you structure it. And also with triggers. So with triggers, obviously those are always an or statement. It's however many you have are going to be, any of these occurring would trigger it to behave. So they want to make sure you understand that. They also want to make sure that you understand how to schedule and the constraints for qualification, right? So here we're looking at, can someone run through once every time? They want to make sure you understand the scheduler, the run batch now, and the run batch later for triggers, and then or for filters, and then also for triggers that's an activation, so forward looking. They want to make sure you understand that there are two different types of items in the smart list. And then they're also going to want to make sure that you understand what variety of choices you have in the flow step. So are you able to, change someone's cadence in a smart campaign? Do you understand what each of those items means when you're adding someone to a list or sending them an email versus sending them an alert, right? Those are all areas that they're going to want to make sure you're very familiar with. So this is another sample question straight from Marketo. They have a marketing manager who wants to run a batch smart campaign to process leads that were both created by a form fill out today and also who visited the company's pricing page. So they want to know which rule logic you would use. So because this is a batch, that means we're using filters, right? So that's why they've got filter here. And then their key here is also, right? So they're looking for people who did this and also this. So in this case, we would be looking at B, which is use all filters. And again, if you picked a different option, then here is the resource for where you would find that information. Okay, so this is one of the big key ones, I think, that is a little bit more black box and maybe not quite as familiar for some end users, but they're going to be testing you on acquisition program and also on new names. So acquisition program has 3 different ways that it can be set. It is set automatically if someone submits their information through a landing page that is a local asset. So it doesn't matter where the form lives. It doesn't matter if it's a form that's local. What matters is it's a landing page that's local. In the instance where someone comes in through a local landing page, meaning local to the program, their acquisition program would automatically be set. Likewise, you can set it during the process of a list upload directly into a program, and that would be another instance of acquisition. And then finally, you can also, if those don't apply to how people are getting into the program, set it inside of a flow step by specifying it's not already been filled and therefore we want to put that information in. Acquisition program in Marketo, for those of you that aren't familiar or need a refresher, simply indicates that that's the first program where engagement or membership was ever seen inside of the system, right? So they were never seen before this webinar. That's going to register on the home screen of the program as acquired by, and acquired by is set by that acquisition program having a value that matches the program name. So right there, that acquired by. If they are showing as one of the acquired by here, that will also calculate them in any reporting as what Marketo calls a new name. So later on in the series, we're going to go into reporting and they'll touch on calculating the new name sort of like factors. So what percentage of people were new names, what was the cost per new name, all that kind of stuff. If you're not setting the acquisition program and you don't understand it correctly, then you wouldn't have that data essentially. So you want to make sure you understand both of those items. And then finally, period cost. So within and this again also touches on reporting, and this is leveraged against new names, but within your program, they'll want to know that you know where to find program costs and how they can be used. So they want to know that you understand that you can have multiple costs for the same period, and that those are summed up and how they're divided and used elsewhere in the system. So when they ask about period costs or program costs, what they're asking for is this. All right. So just kind of running through this quickly, in just quick review, you want to make sure you're good on programs, channels, statuses, that all of the terms associated with default, send programs, event, engagement, and then that you're familiar with assets specifically local versus global, how smart campaigns and specifically the logic on the smart list and the smart campaign works, the program terminology for all of the different things, right? So the exact words that they use. And then program acquisition, new names, how the things sync to Salesforce, and then finally your program costs. So all of these would fall under the umbrella of fundamentals inside of Marketo. I'm giving you some resources if any of these program areas in particular are something that you'd like to brush up on a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A. And obviously this deck will be shared with you after.
I have a quick question. I was wondering how the quiz is going to be formatted. Is it all going to be multiple choices, a mix of multiple choice, true, false, or how is that?
The majority of it is multiple choice. I think there may be a few true, false, but as I recall, I think every question pretty much was multiple choice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And for those of you how many of you are taking or planning on taking MCE at Summit this year? We have hand raisers. I don't even know if we have an option to hand raise in here. So for those of you that are planning on taking it summit, there's a couple. Yep, we got some right hand. Awesome. Okay, cool. Yes, there is a hand raise. I knew there was. I just couldn't find it in my control panel. So what we are expecting, or what to expect at summit when you go, is that you will have a proctored exam. So you'll go to where they have the test available. You'll sign in. You might have to wait for a little bit because sometimes they'll need to wait for a computer to pop up and be available, just depending on how many people are taking the test at one time. So you go into a big room with just lots of fold-out pop-up tables, and they'll have a system for you. And you'll sit down and you'll log in. You'll need to have your web assessor login. If you haven't already created one, they'll have you create one for the first time. And then you'll have 90 minutes to go through the test. So the benefit of taking the test there is that you don't have to worry about having a computer that is like trained in your face and making sure that you're not looking away. Instead, they do have proctors there. So there are people who are kind of just circling around the room. They don't really focus on anyone too much. They're just making sure people aren't being crafty with some notes written up their sleeve or any of that kind of stuff. So you'll have 90 minutes to complete the test. And if for some reason you don't pass on the first time, you can always take it again. I believe the waiting period right now is 6 weeks before you can take it a second time. Taking it at Summit does provide a discount on the test, the total amount that you would pay for it as well. Other questions? And it doesn't even have to be related to the fundamentals, just general MCE test questions or areas that you're trying to figure something out that you haven't been able to find a resource for, whatever. All right. So I feel like fundamentals are always kind of the least exciting part of the MCE because it's the area where most of us spend the majority of our days, our time. And so probably the most familiar. I don't think, I mean, we've covered everything that you need to review to make sure that you're prepared. Does anyone else have any other questions? All right, good stuff. Well, I will be sending out a follow-up to this with the recording. And you should have my, I think, email address through this, but if not, I'll make sure that it's shared post. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask offline, you are more than welcome to circle up with myself or Brooke or any of the other of us, Renee, who run the user group. All right, well, thanks guys for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you for the next edition of this when we dig in on some of the more advanced components of MCE.